Great. Okay, well, it's just coming up to 5 past. So Jenny, if you wouldn't mind just kind of keeping an eye on any latecomers and letting them in from the waiting room, that would be great. But otherwise, we'll get started. So hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name's Rachel Graves. I'm the Visual Arts Officer at Attenborough Arts Centre in Leicester. And we're really excited today to be joined by Ruth Beale and her dad, David. They're going to be talking about Ruth's new work, Like Gods, which is currently on display at Attenborough Arts Centre in an exhibition called The World is a Work in Progress. This is the final week of the exhibition. It ends on Sunday. So if you are able to come to Leicester and see it, please do. The show features work by 7 different artists, all of whom were invited to make work that responded to the idea that the world is a work in progress and to share their visions for the future. Ruth's work, Like Gods, brings together over 1,000 science fiction books from the 1950s through to the 2010s, which were drawn from David's extensive sci-fi collection. The collection of books was put together over many years, mostly from charity shops and secondhand bookshops. And in the gallery, the library is presented in custom-built shelves that spell out the phrase "Like Gods," and that references a book by H.G. Wells called Men Like Gods, which was published in 1923. Visitors to the gallery are invited to explore and browse the books and dip into this collection of all sorts of different speculative worlds and different ways of imagining the future. So I'm going to hand over to Ruth and David now for their conversation, but I've just got a couple of housekeeping points first. So you should have been given notice that we're recording the session and we hope to be able to share it online afterwards. Please feel free to have your video either on or off, depending on what you're comfortable with. But if you could mute your microphones during the talk, and there'll be time at the end to ask a few questions, and you can either speak those questions at the end, or if you wanted to type them into the chat box, then we can read them out for you. And the last point is we've got the live transcription enabled. If you'd like to use it, you can turn it on or off in your own settings, just at the bottom of the screen where it says live transcript. So I think that's everything I've got to say. So I'm going to hand over to Ruth and David.
Thank you, Rachel, and welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Yeah, we're going to have a conversation about the installation, but a lot about Dad David's you know, how he built up this science fiction collection and what's interested him, and yeah, hopefully it's going to be a good chat. I can see that there's a few family members in the digital room, so welcome and thanks for coming. And yeah, we'll talk for, I don't know, half an hour, 35 minutes, and then we can kind of open it up and have more of a conversation together. I'm just going to show you quickly some images in case, because I know not everyone has seen the exhibition, and just to give a bit of context. So this is some of the books when they were in boxes. And as you might know, lots of science fiction books have incredible covers. So here's some of those extraordinary artwork on the covers of just a fraction of the books. And as Rachel mentioned, the bookshelves spell out "Like Gods," which was taken from H.G. Wells' Men Like Gods. I think the edition in the library is the one in the middle, but here's some other editions of that book. Oh, here's a little video. This is when I was sorting the books out, just because you get a real different sense of how many there are when you see them laid out in this way instead of on the shelves. Shelves are quite deceptive, I think. So yeah, that's how many there are. And then this is the installation that's at Attenborough Arts Centre, and really have to thank Rachel for making this happen, and that we had these shelves fabricated, and it was a kind of a way of showing them. But we're going to talk more about how that happened and how it got to be there. But the story is that Dad, you were getting rid of them, weren't you? And I said, you can't. And I took them all to my studio, and they sat in boxes for a bit, and then having this opportunity was like, I'm going to turn them into this artwork instead. So let's come out of that and stop sharing, and let's go back to the beginning, Dad.
The beginning would be when I was a young teenager living in a very small village in Hampshire called Amport, and the library van used to visit once every 2 weeks. And as I lived abroad previously, I'd become an avid reader of anything. And I could read quite a high speed. So my brother and I, my twin brother and I, who is also here.
Hi, Rob.
Hi, Rob. We'd get 4 books a week from the traveling book van. And I don't think we fully appreciated at the time the efforts that the librarian must have made to make sure there was always a selection of science fiction books that we hadn't read on that van. But we would pick up 4 science fiction books every 2 weeks, and we would have easily read them by the time we had to return in 2 weeks' time. So we started reading them, but not collecting books.
Because they'd noticed that you enjoyed them.
Yes, we read them, we'd come across them. I don't quite know where, I can't remember when, but we enjoyed these, especially the science fiction books, where like Asimov and Clarke wrote, where everything had to work. If they described something in their books, it would be a real thing. I talked about communicators and they would communicate sort of thing, but we weren't relying on just saying something worked. They would have to describe give a reasonable excuse for something working, if that makes sense. So we continued like that, and then we then started, as we got older and we had more money, we then started buying some of these science fiction books, and we had them, stored them at my parents' house in a big bookcase, and my brother and I would read the book, take it home, put it in the bookcase, and then the other one would borrow it and read it as well. So we started, that's the start of the collection. So that would be, late 60s, we would start that. And carrying on, then when we'd been to university and we'd gone our separate ways then, we still read something, but nothing like as much, because the main bulk of the collection started, I suppose, when we came back to Britain, which would have been, yes, the mid-70s. You're mute, Ruth.
Sorry, amateur. So you lived abroad from, what was it? In the early 70s, you lived abroad.
Yeah,
you lived abroad for most of the 70s, didn't you? And then you came back.
No, we were abroad from 70 to 73, and then from 77 to 1980. Okay. So, and when we were back, we were quite busy renovating a house. So I don't think I had much time for reading them. So that probably wasn't a very good time for books. And if we had books, but we would have picked up a few. I remember collecting some in Jamaica, actually. So some of the ones, you'll see a little stamp in the books that talks about the bookshop in Spanish Place, I think, in Jamaica. They just went into the bookcase when we got back.
And what happened to those books in the bookcase?
Well, they stayed there until finally my parents had enough. When we both, this would have been in the 80s, I think. My parents said, "Look, you've got to take these books away." Yes. So Rob and I took the books away. I know he's still got some stored in bookcases there. In fact, on the picture, I can see books stored, whether they're science fiction books or not, I'm not sure.
And
yeah, go on.
And then you started buying books when you were didn't you? When you were working, was it in Dorking, and then you would go to the bookshop?
Yes. Well, I worked in Leatherhead for 10 years, and we used to get an hour lunch break, which we were supposed to take an hour. well, lunch didn't take an hour. So for exercise, I would walk into town, and to give the exercise a reason, a focus, I would go into the second-hand bookshops. And there was 2 or 3 charity shops and charity bookshops. I think it was 2 there. So that was easy to pick up 1 or 2 books, 2 books a week, 2 or 3 books a week, especially ones that, because the problem with buying second-hand books is that you never get book 1 of the series. You get book 2 or 3, and then you've got to look out for the other 2 books so that you can try and read the whole thing in series. So it's quite a disjointed way of reading.
Is that one of the reasons why you started a database? Because when I inherited this collection, or seized the collection, there's an Excel spreadsheet that's got all the books and where you bought them, or the price you paid for them, and the publisher and the year, and yeah, you can see then when the series, and if there's any missing, things like that.
Yes, that's why there's you've got the alphabetic list of books that were there, and then there's a list of series, so I could see where to fill in the gaps. And yes.
And was there any other reason for keeping that spreadsheet?
Well, so didn't get too many duplicates, because after if you haven't read it for 5 years, there's only a few books that you'll really remember clearly what they were about. And if you're omnivorously collecting them,
you didn't keep the bookshelves. You didn't keep the books on shelves at home either, did you?
Initially, we did. Yes, initially I kept them on shelves. Yes,
yeah.
And it was only when it got so that would be until we had them for quite a lot. They didn't go into boxes until we ran out of room, really, and everything else spread out. And you girls needed bedrooms and things. Because we used to have bookcases. Yes, when you get above 500, you have difficulty getting bookcases for them.
Yes, and so the books were in the loft, but catalogued.
Yeah, but that was later. They were in bookcase, and a bookcase to start with. And that's when when you appeared on the scene. The first science fiction books you would have seen would have been in bookcases.
I remember the bookcase, and I borrowed some. I remember reading all the John Wyndham books.
Yes.
Really like those, and the classics, Brave New World and 1984, and those real kind of, and J.G. Ballard as well. Oh, yes. And Douglas Adams. Read all the Douglas Adams that were yours.
Yes. Yes, but they would have been in the bookcases. It's only later, when they got just too many, that they started going up. And then I still kept ones I would want to reread often, very often. Because once I started doing this and collecting them, I thought, well, what am I going to do with all these? And then my thoughts were, at the time, in my 30s and 40s, well, I'll keep them. And then when I retire, I can always sell them off on eBay or something. Even though, had eBay been invented, probably Amazon was coming up when it started.
Maybe you'd read about it.
I didn't I would sell them or do something with them. It was only but interesting was to fill in the gaps, to read the different ones of the stories, because the series, I did like the series. And of course, we started off with short stories, the collected short stories, because you've got various awards in science fiction, Hugo and Nebula Awards. I think that's right, yes.
Yeah.
Which, if you buy one that's won one of those awards, a book or a book of short stories that's won those awards, you know you're going to get a good read because they're very high standard. So I noticed today that there are in that schedule, there's lots of short story books, and which are the early ones purchased, and that's what we were getting at the start. Because of course, especially if you're in your teens, it's probably much easier to read a book of short stories than a long book.
And were you looking for particular authors or like a subgenre of science fiction? Or because I remember you reading everything and finding that quite amusing, that you would read, the more literary end of things, and then you'd read the absolute pulp fiction, fantasy, anything.
Yeah. when I was buying them new, but when I'm buying new books, I'm buying it by author normally. Sometimes you accept a new author, but you buy an author that you've read before and you know you've enjoyed the book. Like something that's Ian Banks. I probably got nearly all of the Ian Banks books, which aren't on your list because I've still kept them because I can reread them easily. So there's only about 50 books or so that I kept back. But there we are. But what I'm more interested in is why did you suddenly, when you heard, then when I finally retired, I decided was I going to sell them off? Could I be bothered to take that effort? And I decided no. So I agreed that I would start taking them down the charity shops. And then you leapt in and said, no. And then we had the trouble of transporting all of these books. It took us how many attempts? 3 goes, 4 goes?
Yeah, several bootloads.
Several trips to get them to your studio. And then we had to carry them miles into your studio.
I find it very interesting that you built this up over time, and part of it was kind of happenstance, that you went to charity shops and you had a look and thought, oh, that looks interesting, and you got it, and then through that you built up this collection that part represents what you're interested in, part represents just what's going around,
yes,
what's available, and there's some, I think there's some classics, some really well-known ones. But I think there's some really rare ones. There's some very early. There's ones from the 50s.
Yes.
And I also, I mean, so I'm interested in science fiction as the whole idea of, and we can talk more about this in a moment, like speculative futures, imagining different futures, and that has a dimension as individuals, just like stretching imagination. It has a political dimension. It has more of an ecological dimension now as well, and then so that side of the stories, and then I also, I mean, with this idea of calling the installation like gods, thinking about writers, and particularly writers of science fiction, as people who are kind of manipulating, who are creating worlds.
Yes.
That I suppose sort of transposing that to us as individuals having agency to shape things as they are. I'm not a believer in sort of fate. I think people have agency. Obviously, privilege affords you more, lack of it affords you less, but I think people do have some agency. And then also just as objects, I think they are extraordinary. And this thing about the covers and the artworks, I mean, this is one that I brought home to read.
Yes.
The fact that these pieces of art, these extraordinary pieces of art, got into people's homes and hands, and and that was just very not abnormal thing. That's
yes,
what I find interesting about them.
Because in the bookshop, when they're displayed, there's only a few displayed with a cover. Mostly it's the spine. So the selling point when they turn them round is, of course, the cover. And that's what could draw your attention to it. So that you'll, at least once you've opened the book, you can then see if you want to read it. But if you don't open it at all, you won't wish to read it.
But of all the genres in literature, I think science fiction has had some of the most experimental, extraordinary book covers. I could just bring that up that screen again. This was a bit of a random selection, I'd say.
Yes.
but you can just see. Could you talk a bit about what interests you about science fiction at all? What is it about? Alternative futures and possibilities? Is it about other worlds? You mentioned about science and this connection to something plausible. Yeah, could you just say something about that?
Yeah, I think as a teenager, I was much more, we seemed to concentrate on the books by Asimov and Heinlein that were very science-based. And so that if you went to Mars, you had the description of a rocket that would actually theoretically work. So you get the first ion drives, I think were mentioned in the 60s, an atomic drive, well, and the problems that you would have were discussed in detail. And then gradually I turned over more to the books that presented another world, like if we consider one of the real classics, Ursula Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness, where she imagined a complete planet of humans that were gender neutral and only shifted gender as and when they wished to. So they changed gender to become parents as such. Now,
What was
but
the
that
title again?
What
was the title of that one again?
Ursula Le Guin, Guin, Left Hand of Darkness.
Left Hand of Darkness.
Pick it up with Left Hand of Darkness.
Yeah.
And the first page, it pitches you straight in, and it talks about, it's done as a narrator. The whole book is a narration, really, by an ambassador sent by Earth, the Earth culture, to this planet. And they only sent one person because that's not intimidating. So if you send a ship with lots and lots of people, it can be very intimidating, which is as many people found on Earth. So you just send one person and they can't intimidate. And the walking, and the first page talks about them walking in a procession as they walk through the streets. And then it talks about these musical instruments that are 30-foot long, sort of trumpets. And when they're blown, they're mind-shattering. And they had 20 of them in the procession. And it talked about the people all dressed up and who were there. And then this is all sort of very medieval. And then suddenly at the end, it talks about the cars, the black cars drew up at the end of the procession. So you're still trying to work out, if you haven't read sort of the verb, what sort of planet you're on. And it's very clever, the whole, and then we got we discuss at detail sort of the characteristics of sex, how if you can change sex as a parent, how would this affect your life? So, and the Foundation series of books by Foundation, that was Asimov, wasn't it? Okay, right.
Yeah.
That's a whole series of worlds, isn't it?
I haven't read that.
Yeah, so it's a different world, the different ways out. So in fact, it's, in many ways, I read it as a complete distraction so I can be somewhere else in my own mind. When I'm reading a science fiction book, the ones I really enjoy, I'm somewhere else completely. I don't really look at them as predictors of the future, even though a certain amount, especially Clarke and Asimov. Well, we've never managed to get the sky elevator as proposed by Asimov. I've forgotten which book that was. Where it's set in Sri Lanka, where they build.
Someone here will know.
Remember. I should have looked that up. But we do have predictions.
Sky elevator.
Yeah, sky elevator. Because yes, he predicted that he predicted satellites to start with, radio satellites, right at the beginning, and they happened. We just accepted it. And he's talking about when we invent a strong enough string of wire that will actually put a satellite 1,000 miles up, and we'll just use an elevator to go up in and out of space, which will happen probably next century.
Well, like I was looking at, I was reading the beginning of War of the Worlds the other day, and that ends, doesn't it, with the spoiler alert, the aliens died from bacteria.
Yes.
Which in 1895, I think it was, seems so
yes.
Prescient compared to what our knowledge now about pathogens and bacteria, and also just living through a pandemic, But
yes.
Yeah, that I was also reading in that one about H.G. Wells writing that he was really tickled by like these aliens like stomping through Woking and
Yes, that's right.
and that he just like really enjoyed imagining that alien invasion of
Yes.
North Surrey.
Yes, living near there, it's lovely to think about it all.
Day of the Triffids is set in Surrey as well, isn't it?
Yes, the Day of the Triffids. Of course, this was a very simple concept, but a ray makes everybody blind, except for very few people. And they have these plants escape. I don't know where they came from, and kill everybody. It's quite amazing. But yes, H.G. Wells really, and 2000 Leagues Under the Sea. You know, talking about submarines, that was much, his submarine was very prescient because at that time, they started them in the States in 1850 in the Civil War. They'd had the first submarine, 1865. But submarines weren't, you know, the Nautilus that he was talking about was very prescient.
I wanted to bring up about, and it's mentioned in the text in the exhibition about the bias in science fiction. You know, I think in all fiction and what gets published, and but you know, in the collection there is a bias towards white male European and North American writers, and you know, science fiction is known for its misogyny. I mean, like Asimov, in thinking about, I wanted to put the books in a word or words, a phrase, and one of them that we thought about, or I talked about with you, was foundation, which I liked, but I didn't want to reference Asimov because he was a sort of self-admitted sex pest, you know, and he contributed to the that culture of misogyny in science fiction. And so one of the things we've done in the exhibition is to sort of add some books to the collection that weren't there, so by Black writers, other people of color, by queer writers. I'll put the list in the chat, and some of these aren't new books, but it's just that thinking. I mean, it's not that there aren't any Black writers, women writers, Asian writers in the collection, but there's definitely a dominance of
yeah, but these writers are all fairly modern, aren't they? Or recently published. The books that you put in within the past 20 years, say.
Some of them not. So like Japan Sinks by Sakyo Komatsu. That one is about that book apparently got well known because it almost predicted the tsunami. And then he'd also written a book about a virus that people have been taking notice of recently. There's also a couple of other books by women like Octavia Butler and Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time that I think make kind of important contributions. And then there's books that I haven't read on that list, like Ruqayya Begum, Sultana's Dream. Apparently this is a really well-known Indian book that it was, I think she's a really interesting figure that she managed to write and publish these books at all. And I'm going to put that list in the chat. So I wonder what you thought of that. I don't know,
agree.
whether you feel like it's a criticism or whether you feel like
it's not a criticism. Well, I don't take it as a criticism, of course. What we're doing, well, when we're talking about the bulk of my book buying was, of course, in secondhand books, and they were, as you said, from the 50s and 60s. And of course, the whole writing world was fairly misogynistic. There was only a few women writing, and gradually that did change. We brought McCaffrey in. Ursula Le Guin, and a few of the others came in. So there were women writing, and they were quite successful, and they were successful. But of course, the bulk were as you say, old white men, really, or young white men, some of them.
There's quite a few women who wrote under pseudonyms, aren't there? Like C.J.
Yes.
Terry, and there's one woman who just wrote with a man's name. I've forgotten her name, but I haven't got it here. But, yeah, that was a bit of a thing, wasn't it? So
Yeah,
that's about. So you've got this thing about publishers and what publishers think audiences want, and then what people buy.
yes, that's right. Yes, publishing is. I think the publishers are the ones who decide who is written, and of course,
You get to publish.
if they have published under a man's name, unless they've sort of come out and confessed that they wrote it, we're never going to know, unless you go back and find out who the writer is. But I would agree that is a well, I think that's a criticism of the whole science fiction genre, really, that it's very male orientated and dominated. Is this also a criticism though of the readers? Are more of the readers male rather than female? I don't know.
Well, I think there's a white supremacist bias as well, and how that manifests in stories. But obviously there are also stories that challenge ideas of race and, like you say,
yes.
gender, and
Yes.
And I know that there's a kind of Afrofuturist genre as well. There's a couple of books that we added that might fit into that.
Well, the book by the latest Booker Prize winner, I've forgotten. I should remember.
Oh, Bernadine Evaristo. That's the one. Mum lent me that.
She's got a book in there where, in fact, it was the Africans who were enslaving the white Europeans.
Yeah,
that's pure science fiction. Even though for most of the literary criticism hasn't looked at it in that way, but it's describing an alternative world, which is what a lot of science fiction does. It sets, and science fiction gives an author, if they're talking about alternative universes or alternative worlds, a completely blank canvas. They can do what they like, which can be very useful. Like, well, the Foundation series set in the future, you can go in and the Culture series by Ian Banks, where he's got a whole series of books set thousands of years in the future, and all the worlds are actually run by artificial intelligence, and humans are sort of supported by that.
Mm-hmm.
Which is all quite contentious. We're talking about AI is going to take over now, where he's imagined a world, well, a culture where they already run it. We're worried now. So,
do you feel like we've got a few minutes left where we should speak, and then we should invite other people to speak?
well,
Do you want to either do a bit of a summary of the collection, or is that going to go off? Is that going to take a long time?
Well, it shouldn't. Well, what I could do is spend 2 to 5 minutes. Anybody who's really interested for each decade, picking up a couple of books and making a recommendation. I could do that for 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. As I had a quick look at this, at the list of books, and decided what would be in the 50s. What would I be saying? Frederick Pohl and Kornbluth, The Space Merchants, which describes a world full of advertising and big corporations. That's 70 years ahead. John Wyndham, of course, you've just described those, the books. And then Isaac Asimov would be another key 50s writer. I would talk about Caves of Steel, Stars Like Dust, End of Eternity. So there's lots there.
I mean, you cannot deny Asimov's influence, even though
even though you may not like him.
Conduct. There are so many Asimov books. There are so many.
Yes, he defined it, and especially in his early books, there's no indication whatsoever that he was very misogynistic. And then moving on to the 60s, I think Heinlein comes in, Strange in a Strange Land. That was quite a revolutionary. Frank Herbert, June, where again we've got a complete ecology. He was one of the first people to start describing ecology in the book, because the book, which is set on a desert planet, is very much based on the ecology.
I think a lot of people are reading that at the moment because of the film.
Well,
but
hopefully it's not pressing.
That thing about the relationship between science fiction, ecology, and environmentalism is interesting, isn't it? And kind of imagining what will happen to the world, and also how whole planet ecologies might exist. Yes,
and also it gives you an opportunity to think what would happen to Earth if we don't change our ways. Well, Ursula Le Guin came in. That's when The Left Hand of Darkness. Le Guin, I can never pronounce her name properly. And a lovely one was Daniel Keyes' Flowers, you know, where they managed to improve somebody's, artificially brain-enhancing drugs change somebody's life, and then it goes through and it reverts in the end. But key things in the 50s and 60s were the two magazines, Astounding Science Fiction, of which you can buy summaries of the stories in them, and Magazine of Fantasies and Science Fiction. These, Right. Okay, moving on quickly now. I didn't cover the 70s, really. 80s, Heinlein again, The Name of the Beast, Arthur C. Clarke, Songs of Distant Earth. And what I love was Orson Scott Card, where he didn't imagine, he just imagined a world. He imagined one where we were fighting a war, interplanetary war with an invading species, but that we took children and convinced them they were playing a game. These were medically enhanced children. And that game was in fact being reenacted elsewhere in real life. So they were fighting play battles, but the battles were actually happening. And then David Brin, I don't know, very apocalyptic book, The Postman, which is in fact a book set after the fall of our civilization, but then it's quite uplifting, where he by finding a postman's bag and deciding to deliver them in a crashed truck, but decides to deliver the mail, sort of starts things improving. Brian Aldiss, again, with the Heliconia series, which again imagines a world which orbits the sun with a very, very eccentric orbit. I might take it too long, 40 minutes, so that you have spring, summer, and winter, and it's tropical at one time, and when it's winter, it is completely ice age, and they've got to change their culture. And there's two races living on this planet, and one is better in the cold, and the Earth people are better in the winter. And of course, And moving on to the 90s, we have Kim Stanley Robertson, the 3 Mars books, Red, Green, and Blue, again talking about the ecology of Mars, how they change it, how they transform it, whether they should transform it. The first book is very much, should we do anything at all or do it or not do it? Ian Banks is coming in with his cultures, Accession with his culture books. All right, and what should I say? Yes, because going back to the very earlier books, we talked about Wells. It was Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote a whole series of books about Mars. Yes, so I think I'll leave it there, which was only a very brief discussion, but there's a few names there. If you were interested in science fiction, you could pick them up and find them, hopefully.
Great list. Thank you. So I think let's see if anyone else wants to just say anything or ask a question. You may turn your camera on, you may turn your microphone on, or you can put something in the chat.
Is my microphone on? Can you hear me? This is Ash Howe. Yeah, you can hear me.
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to say I loved the installation. I also liked the tip of the hat to the original Herbert George himself with the Like God's element. And I was most impressed by the fact that the books are in alphabetical order, so I could have a good look through them while I was there. Because like your father, like David, I started collecting science fiction back in the late 60s, 1968. And I've been reading it ever since. And I would never, ever get rid of my collection. I have to say, I'm not tempted to take it to the charity bookshops at all. It's going to stay with me until I pop my clogs. Thank you very much. One comment that I'd like to make is the author you were trying to think of that was the female author who had to write under a male pseudonym. That was Alice Sheldon. She wrote under James Tiptree Jr. And she had a very, very strong viewpoint for feminist views. And that was in the late 60s and early 70s. And I'd just like to ask David one question, which is the thing that always bothers me. Have you read all the books in the installation?
Oh, yes.
Well, then you're one better than I am, sir.
I've read every single one of those books.
And I think some of them more
some of them twice at least. My favourite ones I've read 2 or 3 times.
My collection is about 4,000.
Good.
Something like that. Well, yeah, and I mean, I got rid of 70 when I moved 20 years ago, but I've never really got rid of any books, to be honest. And I've read about 70% of them. So I've worked out that I have to be about 95 before I can die, before I'm allowed to die, because I've got to read them all.
Yes. Well, this is why I was very pleased that Ruth took them over and has made them into this exhibition. I was really pleased about that, this installation.
Well, I think it was lovely. And my fear now, of course, is my wife is an artist. It was her who brought the installation to my attention on the internet. So I went down to see it yesterday. But my wife being an artist, I'm wondering if she's going to have some sort of idea to replicate what Ruth has done. I'm hoping not, but we'll wait and see.
Yes. I'll come and see your exhibition, yes.
Well, I hope by then I'll have read them all as well, yeah.
I'm working on another venue. So fingers crossed, everybody. Possibly even this year might happen. So yeah.
In Leicester?
No, that would be in London. Well, I mean, I'm open to anything, but this was the other venue that I'm just started a conversation with is in London. Anyone else want to chip in or have a question?
Oh, Rob must have something to say, surely.
There you go. Okay, now you're
Unmute.
Yeah, you're okay. You can speak.
Yeah.
Come right close.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Are there any of those stories you want to
I do
corroborate or contradict?
I have passed a few on to my other son's wife. She asked for one of the books. I said yes, because it's based on a film. I said actually it's better than the film. It was called The Martian, the person who was left on Mars. That was, and I said to her, you can take it, quite happy, because I've read it a couple of times. I don't need to read it anymore. And quite a few others I've read, several, Asimov in particular, the Foundation series I've really kept thing on. And various other people, you follow a series, but you have to get, and I get them from the library to a large extent. When we went 2 days ago, I went to the Abingdon Library, picked up some science fiction books and returning some to the library. I mean, we do have everything. Things you see behind me are not science fiction books. They're results from going on conference textbooks, and there's a couple there that I actually wrote.
The thing that I would say is that science fiction to me is one of those things that I don't read because Rob does the reading of it. I'd love to know about science fiction books that actually have nice views and scenery rather than looking as if they've been written in a washing machine. That's what puts me off. But I'm quite happy to let Rob do the reading, and he and Dave, I think, have swapped books quite regularly over the last 50 or so years.
50 years, yes.
Yeah.
I'm quite into books that are about more near futures, you know, so not that complete other fantasy, you know, something things I liked Octavia Butler's Parable series. I read those last year because they're about America that's kind of collapsed, and I think she wrote them in the 80s, but people got very excited about them when Trump was in, because it was almost predicting what was going could happen, that people ended up living in these sort of walled communities, and then they all ended up sort of like having to try and move north where there's water, and there's various kinds of social breakdown going on everywhere. I like that. And also I think Woman on the Edge of Time is an interesting one. Rachel, you suggested that, didn't you, for the
yeah, that's right, that's one that I was reading kind of as we were installing the exhibition, actually, and yeah, was really interesting in terms of its kind of I suppose its assessment of mental health treatment at the time. It was written, I think, in the 1960s or 70s in the US, but also this sort of slippage into different times, and sort of near futures or not too distant futures, and different societal structures. Yeah, I really loved that book.
Yeah, quite like the ones that are imagining different sort of political possibilities as well. And that one deals with the utopia as well, doesn't it? It's sort of like, it's like the present is a dystopia and the future, and it's jumping between the two. And I think utopias are very hard. Utopias, I think, especially in film, actually, maybe not. Well, utopias are usually much more boring. You know, I read Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland, and it's very like it's explaining the place, because it's a place that's entirely occupied by women who can reproduce, and you know, often dystopias make better storylines.
Yeah, you sometimes feel like they're more fun to write. Yeah.
We've got a couple of things in the chat. So Colin, hello, cousin Colin. Says, there's a very committed third generation of Beale science fiction readers up here in the York Beale household. She's into any science fiction, space-based science fiction, so proper washing machine settings.
I think that's an interesting comment, Ruth, and I'm just wondering how you would start children, perhaps even your children, reading science fiction. Do you recommend?
I've got a set of books they can put their hands on.
Well, you know, you're talking a pre-teen. What could they start with?
They like the films, don't they? You know, they like Star Wars.
Exactly. Yeah, they like fantasy to that level.
So I'd say yes, start them off on Lego Star Wars. We'll be in Octavia Butler and Asimov before you know it, I think. And Claire says, David, do you miss the books? Dad?
Sorry, do I miss the books? Well, no, because as I didn't say today, I actually kept at least 50 books, of which I want to reread. You know, I went into the into the boxes before they left and pulled out the ones that I definitely want to reread. So, and the problem is that I couldn't find one or two. So I asked Ruth to try and find them for me. When the exhibition comes down, where there's book one of the series. There we are. Like Heliconia, Winter, Summer and Spring. I will reread that and hand it over to Ruth. And in fact, some of the recent ones. But Ruth, I hadn't fully realized that you were reading much science fiction.
Yeah, amongst everything else. I do like to read women writers. And yeah, this thing about near fiction. And
so would this be Cheryl McCaffrey, or wouldn't you read those?
Margaret Atwood.
Margaret Atwood, yes. Yes, because The Handmaid's Tale is pure science fiction.
Yeah, I read that a few years ago and loved it, and then really enjoyed the TV series. I kept thinking about them, like I'd be thinking, oh, I wonder how they're getting on in Gilead. Got to go watch the next episode. And I find that so interesting that they took her book and they've expanded on it. But also what I love about, sorry to jump back in, but that she has based it all on things that have happened.
Yes.
So, you know, all the atrocious, terrible, we might imagine that in these books that, oh, it couldn't really happen, but you know, it's based on all sorts of terrible things that have happened in the world at different places at different times.
Yes.
Already. Colin, I was actually going to come back to Colin and say, how did this love of sci-fi emerge? So she started with some of the recent teenage dystopia literature. Yes, there is lots of teenage dystopia literature, some of which are really good in a whole genre that is new for the 21st century. Many of them have echoes of the older classics, and I got into some of the classic stuff by lining to those. Also, Doctor Who makes plenty of references, linking to those. Doctor Who makes plenty of references to those classics, which inspired her a lot.
I didn't know that.
Right, yeah. But also, I mean, a lot of Asimov has stuff on robotics and artificial intelligence, which is actually being considered nowadays with what's going on. So he was 20 to 30 years ahead of science.
Robotic, that's 50.
50 years ahead.
In
his books, he was writing about it in the 60s.
Are there any of the can you remember any of the teenage ones, Colin, that you could recommend? And did you read any of them? No.
I would have recommended for teenagers the books of short stories. Because if you get a book, there's always going to be 2 or 3 stories that you really like. And these would be the Galaxy short stories. There's a whole series of those. What else? Nebula Award series.
So what? Nebula?
Nebula Award, they published it every year in the Galaxy Awards. Hugo Awards, every year. I think these are still going on. Oh, it's Astounding Science Fiction by John Campbell. He carried through to the 70s and published books of short stories as the editor. I mentioned it earlier, the magazine of science fiction and fantasy and science fiction, and the Astounding Science Fiction magazines. They publish books.
They're quite a good way to see which writers you like, aren't they? Because you can read a collection and then... Yeah,
and then if you get 12 stories in a book, hopefully you'll like at least 1 or 2 of them.
I've got a final question for all the collectors here. Like, what? So Rob mentioned getting books from the library, but why? And you, Dad, talked about hanging on to them, but maybe this is also for Ash. You know, what makes you want to hang on to them and have this collection, basically?
Why I want? Well, yeah, I mean, like your dad, I have debated with selling them. Now I am retired, but I haven't read them all yet. I'm debating leaving them to the British Science Fiction Association as a collection. I mean, they're worth an absolute fortune because they go back to the 50s, some of these paperbacks. I've got magazines going back to 1940 because I've got a series of Astounding Science Fiction magazines from 1940 to 1980. I've got Galaxy magazine from 1950 to 1980. I've got the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, the last 40 years worth on the shelves. But the real reason I won't get rid of them is because I've grown up with them. There's books here that I can get off the shelf and I know that I've read that same copy 50 years ago and I'm going to go and read it tomorrow again. So there's a continuity in my life. I couldn't imagine being in a house without these books now. And you know, there's certain of these that I know I've read 2 or 3 times and I doubt if I'll ever read them again before I die. But hey, I'm still going to have them, and they'll still have that memory of I've touched them all these years. So no, I'll never get rid of them. But what will happen to them when I go is another matter. I hope they stay together as a collection and get sold rather than piecemeal. But it's taken me 50 years to get them together. I want to save somebody else the trouble, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dad, do you want to say anything before we?
Well, of course, I'll bequeath you the rest of my science fiction books, or pass them on as and when I finish reading them.
Thanks. Oh, well, thanks everyone very much for coming and having this conversation. It's been really
No,
nice.
thank you very much.
Yeah, and thanks to Ruth and David as well for being so generous with your time. And yeah, Ruth, I hope you managed to find another venue to show the collection. It'd be great to know that it's going on to continue.
Yeah, and those shelves are really big if they're in my studio. Yeah, no, I'd like to. We'll talk more about that. Good. Okay.
Great. Okay, well, thanks so much, everyone. And just to reiterate, the exhibition is on until this Sunday. So yes, last chance to see it. And yeah, that's it. Thanks so much for coming. And we'll hopefully be sharing the recording of the session to our social media pages. So do look out for that. And if you know anyone who would enjoy the conversation, share it with them. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.